Welcome back. In this lesson, we'll join Kai and the Habitz team as they build their design system. We'll focus on some core design system features in Figma, styles and components, as well as some tips for defining and organizing your system. We'll explore the different types of styles you can create components, variants, and other component properties, and establish consistent naming conventions across the system. Before we get too far ahead, let's define what Figma means by styles, components, and libraries. Styles allow us to define a collection of properties or settings we want to reuse. We can use styles to capture specific color values for fills and strokes, define text properties like font, line height, and letter spacing, make presets for shadow and blur effects, and create reusable scaffolding in the form of rows, columns, and layout grids. You may have heard about tokens or seen them in another design system. Figma is working on features to support tokens, which we'll explore in a future video. Components are the building blocks of our design system. In a design system, they're the elements, structures, and patterns we want to reuse in our designs. They can be individual elements like icons or buttons, or a collection of elements like menus and layouts. There are two aspects to a component: a main component that defines the properties of the component, and an instance or copy of the component, which you can reuse in any of your designs which receive any updates made to the component. Libraries are collections of styles and components shared within a team or organization. They establish consistency, streamline workflows, and keep elements up to date across designs. Select the styles and components you want to share. Publish them as a library to your team or organization. Access libraries to use styles and components in your files. Review updates and apply them across the file. There are lots of different ways to set up a library. In Figma, each published library is linked to a file. But a library could use styles and components from another library. You could keep everything in one file as a single source of truth, or break it into individual files to better suit your team or organization's needs. Here are some things to consider when deciding on an approach. Does your product design team share colors and assets with your brand team? Does your company have multiple themes, separate products, or a collection of brands? Are there resources that you want to share or don't want to share between brands or products? Do you have separate design and engineering teams for desktop and mobile development? Do your design system users need access to every style and component? The Habitz team are a small company with a single product. They're still exploring the value a design system could bring to their product design team. It may take some time for the rest of the company to get on board. For now, Kai and the team will create a single file for their style and component library. As their design system matures, they may need to consider breaking up their components between files. For example, a separate file for their foundational styles, a dedicated icon library, separate component libraries for web and mobile, and perhaps some functional components like a wireframe library or sticker set. The approach that works for you may be different to what works for Kai and the Habitz team. Check out our best practices guide for more information and guidance. Kai sets up a design systems project within their design team and creates a new design file. They want to use pages to organize the different aspects of the system. They set up a welcome page to introduce the system, as well as pages for foundations, components, and patterns. Back in the audit file the team made earlier, the Habitz team have organized their design elements into groups. They've identified a variety of elements that exist across their designs: a range of colors, a number of fonts and text sizes, and a bunch of icons. Beyond those foundational elements, there are some other consistent patterns across designs, as well as some obvious discrepancies. When it comes to turning these into components, the team are a little overwhelmed and don't know where to start. Kai suggests they use the principles of atomic design to rebuild their components from scratch. Atomic design, popularized by Brad Frost, takes cues from the structure of chemical compounds, atoms, molecules, and organisms, and uses this analogy to describe a modular approach to building components. Atoms are the basic building blocks of matter. In a design system, they represent elements that can't be broken down any further without losing its function, like an icon, input field, or button. Molecules are groups of two or more atoms that are bonded together. In a design system, they're a collection of individual elements that together form a single unit, like a search bar made up of an icon, input field, and button. Organisms are complex structures made up of molecules and atoms. like a navigation menu that includes a search bar, along with a logo and other menu items. The Habitz team take a look at some of their more complex elements, check to see if there are parts of that element that are reused elsewhere, and identify the basic building blocks of each. There are some components in the Habitz app that have stricter applications. The team have decided to capture these as patterns separate from their more atomic and molecular components. This makes it clear to people using the system that these components should be implemented in the specific way they've been created. In this header element, we have an avatar, the brand word mark, and a notifications icon. Each of these elements are atomic components. They can function alone or be combined with other atoms and molecules to create new designs. But the header must always consist of these elements in this specific order, so we treat this component as a pattern. Even if you don't call them atomic components, a modular approach that has that flexibility is worth considering. To learn more about atomic design, check out the resources we've linked. The team have identified universal attributes of their designs like color and typography. They've also grouped elements from their audit into components and patterns. Before they start building out these components, they need to align on an approach for naming them. Kai reached out to the engineering team to align on a common naming convention to make it moving from design to code easier for everyone. The engineering team already uses camel case for their elements and code, so Kai decides to also use this approach for layer names, components, and component props. But you might prefer another approach for your design system, like snake case, title case, or all caps. Or maybe you'll separate words with dashes or dots. Whatever you choose, having the same name for an element in design and code is more important than the way you write it. With a clear path forward, the Habitz team divides the work between them and gets started building out the system. In the previous lesson, we talked about spacing and how it contributes to the architecture of our designs. The Habitz team uses a modified version of an 8-point grid system, which allows for some limited flexibility around 4 and 6 points as they work on mobile experiences. There are a few Figma features they can use to keep things in line, but for the most part, spacing will be communicated to design system users through their documentation. We'll follow Kai as they document these decisions in their next video. To help enforce the grid system, Kai can define layout grid styles. Layout grids can be made up of rows, columns, or a uniform grid like the 8-point grid. Kai starts by creating a frame and naming it default grid. In the right side bar, they click the plus icon next to the layout grid. They click the grid icon to adjust the properties, update the size to 8, and leave the default red color. Now they'll make it into a style. Click the style icon in the layout grid section, then the plus icon. Kai names it 8-point grid, adds a description, and clicks Create Style. Another inconsistency in their existing designs were icon designs and sizes. A modular layout grid, a combination of 2 or more grids, would help designers create standard dimensions and padding for icons. In Figma, you can apply multiple layout grids to a frame and define them as a single style. Kai wants all of their icons to live in a 24 by 24 frame, with consistent padding between the icon and its parent frame. They create a 24 by 24 frame, add a layout grid and change the type to column, set the count to 1, gutter to 0, and the margin to 3. They hover over the grid in the right side bar and press Command-D to duplicate it. Then, switch the type to row. Finally, they create a new layout grid style and name it Icon Grid. They also want to make use of Autolayout, a property you can add to frames. With Autolayout, you can define the space between layers in a frame, as well as any vertical and horizontal padding. This allows you to maintain consistent spacing and layout as the frame's content changes. The Habitz team can keep elements aligned to the 8-point grid by making sure each Autolayout property is a multiple of 8. To make it easier to quickly update the distance between layers, Kai updates their big nudge settings to 8-point. Nudge values are set per person, so Kai makes a note to add this as a suggestion for other designers. You can see colors in every aspect of the Habitz designs. There are different hues, tints, and tones that represent the brand's primary colors. Without a limited palette of colors, it would be easy for the team to end up with an infinite number of colors or inconsistent values between designs. The Habitz team can use styles to not only define their colors, but to make it easier to apply and update colors across the design system. They've already collected their different colors used in their designs. The next step is to create color styles for all of the colors they've collected. Before they do that, they need to define a system for naming and organizing the color styles. There are a few different approaches you could take. If you had multiple brands or themes, you could organize your colors that way. You could organize colors by type, like by primary and secondary functions, or by application, like text, buttons, and alerts. Or you could arrange colors by hue. If your engineering team already has an established color palette, you can align with that to avoid duplicating your efforts. Kai wants to make it easy for designers to find the right styles, so they'll start with some basic functional groups with the goal of partnering with the engineering team and moving towards a semantic token system in the future. With a functional approach in mind, 4 distinct groups emerge. The primary brand colors with a variety of tints and tones, a range of neutral tones for less important elements and actions, a selection of colors for defining user habits, and some colors for specific functions in the app, like destructive actions and alerts. The Habitz team can use the / naming convention in Figma to organize the styles into groups. For every / they add to the style's name, Figma creates another folder or level of organization. Kai creates styles for the 2 functional colors. To name the styles, they add its function followed by a /, then a value. They use the description to guide designers towards any specific use cases. But they'll also need to build out some documentation that explains this approach to naming. Typography is an important aspect of the Habitz app. You can see typography in core elements and experiences like Habitz, app cards, and even the calendar. Kai can use text styles in Figma to define properties like font family, weight, and size, as well as line height and letter spacing. They need to define a semantic type system that captures how the text is used in the app and is easy to understand and apply. During the audit, Kai identified 2 typefaces or font families: Space Grotesque, a futuristic monospace font which they use for larger text sizes like headings and titles, and DM Sans, a lighter sans serif typeface which they use for smaller text sizes like descriptions and the calendar layout. Between these 2 typefaces, they identified 12 unique combinations of color, size, weight, line height, and letter spacing. In Figma, a text layer's color is defined by a color style, not a text style, so Kai consolidates any text differentiated by color alone. There's also typography for specific applications, which they can document as exceptions instead of including them as distinct styles. Like this third typeface, Smooch Sans, which is used more like a visual element than a text style during the add habit flow, or these text layers in different weights. Now they have 7 distinct combinations of text properties, with font sizes that loosely follow the major second scale and fit within an 8-point grid. From these styles, they can identify 2 main use cases: 4 title styles for core elements and wayfinding, like page headings and card titles, and 3 body styles for page contents or long-form text, like descriptions, calendar days, and dates. They could categorize them further by use case, but they'd end up with multiple styles that share the same properties. Instead, they decide to organize them further by size. Both title and body styles have a base size of 16 points, as well as medium and large styles with an extra large title style. They update the text samples to better reflect their size, then create a text style for each one. They use the / naming convention to create separate groups by use case, title and body, and size. In our previous lesson, we spoke about how elevation can establish hierarchy, create separation, and communicate interaction. The Habitz team has embraced a flat, minimalist approach across most of their designs, but there are a few elements that stand out from the rest: buttons, cards, and the main navigation menu. They all share a bold, neo-brutalist style with a thick black border and a solid offset shadow. While you can interact with other elements in the app, this styling draws attention to the core focus of the app: creating and managing habits. At the moment, the elements all have the same properties, so technically Kai only needs 1 entry for elevation in the design system. But Kai and the team have been considering other ways to use elevation. They were inspired by responsive or dynamic elevation in the material design system, changing an element's elevation when you interact with it. Kai thinks an extra chunky shadow for focused elements would help low vision habit trackers. They decide to define 3 levels of elevation. 4 to match the value of the current shadow, and 2 extra values consistent with their spacing system, 6 and 8. By aligning on these values and defining these styles now, the team has approved resources whenever they're ready to explore those ideas. They create a square frame, round the corners, and add a fill. They add a text layer to label the shadows. They create 2 more frames and update the labels accordingly. Then select all the frames, apply Autolayout, and adjust the padding and space between them. In the right sidebar, Kai adds an effect and edits the setting of the default drab shadow. To get that neo-brutalist style, they set the blur to 0 and the shadow opacity to 100. They repeat the process for the remaining 2 levels. Looking good! Now Kai can create effect styles for these properties. They select the first frame and click the style icon in the effects section, then the plus icon to create a new style. They name it elevation/4 and add a description. Then, repeat the process for the 6 and 8 level shadows. If we view the file's local styles, all 3 shadows are grouped in an elevation folder. Nice! The Habitz team uses icons and illustration to support the personality of their brand, a bold neo-brutalist style with some whimsical elements. They've also aligned on supporting 3 different icon sizes, 16, 24, and 32. They start by building the middle icon size. They placed each icon in a 24 by 24 frame, aligned to the icon grid they created earlier. This makes sure icons are centered, aligned, and consistent in size when swapping between icons. They did the same thing for icons with dimensions of 16 and 32. With every icon in their collection selected, they select Create Multiple Components from the toolbar and turn each icon into a component. Kai checked with the Habitz engineering team to make sure icon names are consistent with code as well as searchable by anyone using the design system. They aligned on a naming structure of icon/size/name and applied that to all icons. This makes sure icons are grouped in the Assets panel, first by icon, then by size. Because the icons are now components, they can add descriptions to communicate their intended use. They can also include extra search terms to make the icons easier to find. Habitz uses illustration to reinforce their brand and add that touch of whimsy to the product. Like icons, illustrations benefit from consistent frame sizes and thoughtful naming and descriptions. The Habitz team uses illustrations in 2 ways: as large hero images during onboarding screens, and as smaller illustrations for the action presentation cards. These smaller illustrations also have an optional accent color. Kai wants to create 2 separate component sets, one for each use case. This will make it easier for designers to find the right illustration for their context. They start by giving each illustration a name that captures both its use case and type. With the hero illustration selected, they choose Create Component Set from the toolbar. In the right sidebar, they update the default property in the Properties section, Property 1, to rename it Type. For the action presentation card illustrations, Kai wants to add another attribute to each name to account for the accent color. Kai selects the action presentation card illustrations with the accent color and uses bulk rename to add /true to the end of the current name. Then uses /false for the illustrations without the accent color. With all the illustrations selected, they click Create Component Set. Because of the extra attribute, the Action Presentation Card Component Set has 2 properties with correct values for each variant. They update the property names to Type and Has Color respectively. To make the illustrations easy to find, they decide to add illustration to the beginning of each component set's name. Now that Kai has the foundations of the design system captured, it's time to put these concepts together. One core flow of the Habitz app is creating a new habit. As part of this process, users select which days they want to include in their habit schedule. Kai wants to create a pattern for this schedule, but to make a pattern, they need a component that is the toggle for an individual day. The component needs 2 different states, a deselected state and a selected state. Kai uses this existing element of the selected state and turns it into a component, renames it day toggle, adds a variant from the toolbar, which also creates a new variant property, which they'll set to false for the new variant. Then they rename the property to isSelected, style the false variant by removing the stroke property of the new component and changing the color to primary/1, and then set that property to true for the original selected variant. Habitz also allows people to track a habit multiple times a day. How would you make a variant that shows the habit frequency? Check out the file to see what the Habitz team made. The Habitz team will need to use this component for every day of the week. Kai could create a variant for each day, but to better support multiple languages, they create a text component property instead. This allows designers to update the text to match the day. They select the text layer, and in the content section, create a text component property, and name it day character. Lastly, Kai wants the deselected variant to be the default component in this set. In Figma, the default variant is the component in the top left corner. They swap the variants to suit. In addition to call to action buttons, Habitz has interactive cards made up of 3 elements: an editable text layer, an illustration, and an icon. Because the cards are interactive, they need 4 states: default, hover, focused, and pressed. Kai starts by building the default state with the 3 elements we mentioned earlier. Then, they set up component properties for the aspects of the component that designers will be able to adjust. First, Kai needs to define how the card illustration can be swapped for another illustration. With the illustration selected, they create an instant swap property. They name it illustration, and click Create Property. Next, Kai wants to make it so people can update the contents of the text layer. They select the text layer, and in the Content section, click the Create Property button. They name it Text and make sure the default value is Add. Finally, Kai wants designers to be able to change the component's default icon to another icon. They can do this using an instant swap property. They select the icon and click Create Component Property in the right sidebar. They select Create Property and name the property Icon. Now that Kai has component properties for the default state, they can set up variants for the remaining states. Kai selects the default component and adds a new variant. From the right sidebar, they rename the variant Hover and the component property to State. The only difference between the hover and default states is the color, so all Kai needs to do is click Primary 1 in the right sidebar and change the color to Primary 5. All done. The focus state has a more prominent stroke compared to the default. To create the focus state, they select the component set and add a new variant. They rename it to Focused and increase the stroke weight to 4. Finally, Kai creates a new variant for the pressed state. They name it Pressed, update the fill color to Primary 20, and remove the elevation style. Kai and the team continue to build out more components for their system. To see all the components they've created, check out the Components page in the Habitz file. With their flexible components created, Kai now has to build out some of the fixed patterns in the design system. A core part of the Habitz app is letting people set a schedule every time they create or edit a habit. Given its importance in the app, Kai wants to create a fixed pattern so it's always created in the same way. Kai decides to build the weekly schedule using the existing day toggle component. From the Assets panel, Kai finds the day toggle component and drags it onto the canvas to create an instance. To make it easier to add new toggles, Kai adds an Autolayout frame around the toggle. They press Enter to select the child layer, in this case the toggle. Then use the Command or Control-D shortcut to create 7 toggles in total. They update the padding on all sides to 0, and the space between to 10. In the Components section of the right sidebar, Kai can see the component properties they set up earlier. They update the day character property to the correct day and change each toggle to match. They click Create Component in the toolbar, then name the new component Day Selector. The order of days should always be chronological, but they can be arranged to accommodate regional differences for the first day of the week, like Saturday, Sunday, or Monday. Kai wants to communicate this to anyone who uses the component. In the right sidebar, they click the Edit icon and add this information to the description. Kai continues by defining another pattern. This one is a core navigational element in Habitz. A floating menu bar where users can create new habits and move between different pages of the app. The navigation element has a fixed layout with no customizable properties. It changes state depending on which page the user is on in the app. Kai uses variants to represent each state. An alternative approach might be to create Boolean properties for the pattern. However, this could allow for a state where both indicators are active. Variants are a way to ensure that only one state is selected at a time. If you want to see exactly how this component was set up, grab a copy of the Habitz design system file and check it out. Together, the Habitz team has created order out of chaos. They turned a jumble of different elements and designs into a comprehensive library of components. They've created patterns for the system's more structured components. They defined styles for color, typography, elevation, and layout grids. They curated a collection of brand-friendly icons and illustrations. And they were intentional about what designs to include in the design system and what to leave out. Before the Habitz team makes the design system available to the whole company, they want to set everyone up for success. The team wants to make sure everything is documented so that other people know how to use the system. They also want to create a process for updating and maintaining the system over time. Lastly, Kai wants to get feedback from key stakeholders across the company, like brand and engineering teams, to make sure the system fits in with other teams' practices and resources. In the next video, we'll check back in on Kai and the Habitz team as they document their design system, support people who want to use it, and decide how to maintain it over time. I'll see you in the next one.